The wind was a blade scraping the mountains raw and carrying the taste of iron. It screamed down from the high peaks, a physical force that sought to strip the world to its bones. Luke Calloway leaned into it, his body a bulwark against the gale, the frozen wool of his coat stiff as timber. Snow driven horizontal stung his exposed cheeks like 1,000 needles. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, the world reduced to a maelstrom of churning white. Dust, he roared the name, torn from his lips and swallowed by the blizzard. Dust, you stubborn fool. An hour ago, they had been checking the southern fence line when the storm had descended without warning, a silent gray curtain falling from the sky. The first gust had been a shock wave, spooking the bay gelding. Dust had bolted a dark shape swallowed by the blizzard in an instant, leaving Luke alone in the heart of the tempest. Now he was following the horse's tracks, a faint series of depressions already filling with fresh powder. It was a fool's errand. The tracks could lead him in circles until he collapsed from exhaustion, another frozen corpse for the spring thaw to reveal. But the horse was all he had left. The ranch, the land, the silence. They were just things. Dust was a presence, a steady companion in the long, quiet years since Mary was gone. The ache in his left side, an old war wound, pulsed with a dull, insistent rhythm, a counterpoint to the howling wind. Each step was a negotiation with the ice-crusted ground beneath the snow. He shielded his eyes, peering into the white abyss. It was instinct more than sight that kept him moving. He knew this land had memorized its contours in the lonely years of his self-imposed exile. He was aiming for the shallow creek bed, a landmark that might offer a sliver of shelter. And then he heard it. A faint whinny carried on a lull in the wind. Dust. He pushed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tracks grew clearer. Up ahead, a dark shape resolved itself from the swirling snow. It was Dust standing near the cut bank of the frozen creek, head low, unmoving. Relief washed over Luke, so potent it almost buckled his knees. But the relief was short-lived. The horse wasn't waiting for him. He was standing vigil. Dust snorted, pawing at a mound of snow near his hooves. As Luke drew closer, he saw the mound wasn't just snow. A patch of dark deerskin was visible, and a spray of black hair fanned out like spilled ink against the whiteness. He fell to his knees beside the horse, his hands raw with cold as he clawed at the snow. A curse escaped him, a plume of white in the frigid air. He uncovered a body, a woman lying face down, half buried. She was small, dressed in torn and dirtied deerskin. Apache. One arm was curled beneath her, the other stretched out, her fingers clenched into a tight fist. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her. She was light terrifyingly, so a bundle of cold limbs and brittle bones. He expected her to be dead, another victim of the unforgiving wilderness. But as he shifted his grip, a low moan escaped her lips. Her head lolled back against his arm. She was alive. He stumbled toward the faint promise of his cabin a half-mile away, with the woman in his arms and Dust trailing faithfully behind. The wind fought him every step, trying to reclaim its prize. The woman's weight, slight as it was, became a leaden burden pulling at the old wound in his side, until every breath was a sharp intake of pain. Inside, the sudden silence of the cabin was deafening after the storm's roar. He laid her gently on his cot, the only bed in the one-room dwelling. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He shoved the door shut, barring it against the wind, and worked with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much death. He stoked the fire in the potbelly stove until its iron sides glowed a dull cherry red. He boiled water, his hands moving with a sureness that belied the tremor he felt deep inside. As he cut away the torn sleeve of her dress to examine the wound on her shoulder, a clean, deep slice crusted with dark blood, He noticed the object still clutched in her frozen hand. He had to pry her fingers open one by one. They were stiff, unyielding. When her fist finally relaxed, a small object fell into his palm, attached to a broken leather cord. It was a silver locket, small oval tarnished with age and etched with a delicate floral pattern. His breath caught in his throat. He knew this locket. He had bought it from a traveling tinker in Santa Fe the year before the fever. He had given it to Mary on their second anniversary. His fingers, clumsy with cold and shock, fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside, protected by a thin pane of glass, was a miniature portrait, faded but unmistakable. The gentle curve of Mary's smile. The light in her eyes that he had thought he'd never see again. He stared at the tiny face, his mind a hollow chamber where a single, impossible question echoed. The storm howled outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. But Luke heard nothing. He saw only the face of his dead wife, held in the hand of a dying stranger. How in God's name did this Apache woman have Mary's locket? The discovery was not a clue. It was a ghost that had just walked out of the blizzard and laid down in his bed, tying him to a mystery he didn't want a past he had worked for 3 years to bury. He looked from the locket to the woman's still face, her dark lashes stark against the pallor of her skin. Trouble had found him, and it was wearing his wife's memory around its neck. He closed the locket with a soft click, the sound as final as a coffin nail. First, he would save her life. Then, he would demand answers. His hands, which had trembled moments before, were now perfectly steady. He threaded a needle from the small tin kit that had followed him home from the war. The last time he had stitched a wound this deep, it had been in a field hospital with the screams of dying men as his chorus. He cleaned the gash with carbolic acid, stitched the skin together with 2 neat, economical passes, and wrapped it tightly with clean linen. She flinched once, a tremor that ran through her body, but she did not wake. When it was done, he stood back, the silver locket cold and heavy in his palm. He covered her with his thickest wool blanket and left a cup of water on the small crate beside the bed. Then he dragged the single wooden chair from his small table and sat down, his elbows on his knees, staring at the woman as the fire popped and hissed. He was no longer just a man trying to survive a storm. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of a life inexplicably tangled with his own. The silence in the cabin no longer felt empty, but settled like dust on old furniture waiting to be disturbed. He watched her breathe each shallow rise and fall of the blanket, a testament to the fact that whether he liked it or not, his isolation was over. The first pale light of morning filtered through the grimy window pane, illuminating a world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. The landscape was buried under a thick blanket of unbroken snow, the sharp edges of the world softened into gentle curves. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low to a bed of glowing embers. Luke's neck and back ached from a night spent slumped in the chair, a sentinel at his own hearth. He hadn't slept. He had watched. He had watched the steady, fragile rhythm of her breathing, half expecting it to cease with each exhale. But she had held on. The blanket was pulled up to her chin, her face turned toward the wall. She was still here. He rose, his joints protesting, and added split pine to the stove. The wood caught with a hungry crackle, and soon the familiar scent of smoke and brewing coffee began to chase the chill from the room. It was the smell of any other morning, a routine so ingrained it felt alien in the face of the extraordinary. A soft rustle of wool broke the spell. He turned. She was stirring. Her fingers moved first, curling weakly at the edge of the blanket. Then her eyes opened. They were dark, deep-set, and for a moment clouded with disorientation. Luke froze the coffee pot still in his hand. She blinked slowly, her gaze sweeping over the rough-hewn log walls, the glowing stove, the shelves lined with tins and jars, before finally landing on him. Her body went rigid. "You're safe here," he said. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly from disuse and the cold. He kept his distance, not wanting to spook her. "You were hurt. I stitched the wound." Her gaze dropped to her bandaged shoulder, a flicker of memory or pain in her eyes. She pushed herself up on her good elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at the stitches. Her lips parted, and she spoke a string of words, in a language he didn't understand, the sound soft and guttural. Then she switched to a halting broken English. "You, not soldier." The question hung in the air, heavy with a history he could only guess at. He shook his head once, a curt, definitive movement. "No, not anymore." A fraction of the tension left her shoulders, though her eyes remained wide and wary, like a doe ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. He set the coffee pot on the stove and pulled his chair back to the table, deliberately creating space between them. "Name's Luke," he said, tapping his chest with his thumb. "Luke Calloway." She watched him for a long moment, as if weighing the name. Then with her good hand, she touched her own chest. "Nia," she whispered the name, a soft exhalation. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. He nodded toward the cup of water he'd left for her. "Drink." She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. She drank it, all her throat working, then set the empty cup down. The silence was broken by a loud growl from her stomach. A faint blush crept up her neck. "Hungry," she admitted, the word sounding foreign on her tongue. He ladled a portion of yesterday's beans, which he'd kept warm on the back of the stove, onto a tin plate. He set it on the table, then stepped back to the hearth, giving her a clear path. She watched him, her dark eyes tracking his every move. Finally, she swung her legs over the side of the cot. She was unsteady on her feet, but when he made a move to help, she shot him a look that stopped him cold. She would not show weakness. She crossed the small room, barefoot, her worn moccasins sitting by the hearth where he'd left them to dry. Up close, he could see the full extent of her ordeal. Her calves were smudged with dirt, her knees bruised and scraped raw. The deerskin dress was torn at the hem and the fabric weathered and thin. Someone had treated her brutally. The thought tightened a cold knot in his gut. She ate sitting on the very edge of the chair, poised to flee. But as she realized he wasn't going to move, wasn't going to take the food away, she relaxed fractionally and finished the beans quickly, scraping the tin plate clean with her spoon. When she was done, she set the plate down and looked at him. Her expression unreadable, a careful mask of neutrality. He kept his voice even gentle. "You can stay, until you're strong enough to travel." She frowned at the word stay, turning it over in her mind. She gave a single hesitant nod. He took her plate and washed it in the basin, letting her watch. He understood what she was doing. She was learning him. She needed to know if he was the kind of man who yelled, who struck, whose moods were a landscape of hidden dangers. He kept his movements slow and predictable, the way he did when gentling a skittish colt. When he went outside to check on dust, the glare of the sun on the snow was blinding. The horse nickered, nudging his chest in greeting. As Luke poured grain into the trough, he felt eyes on his back. He turned. Nia was standing in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a spare flannel shirt he'd left on a peg. The sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and the hem fell to her knees. She didn't speak, just watched her silhouette, a dark shape against the firelit interior. The weight of her gaze was unfamiliar. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him with such sharp, assessing attention. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that whatever trouble had driven her to his doorstep was far from over, and he had just made it his own. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet unease, his mind circling back to the locket which he tucked away in his saddlebag. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a poor distraction. He repaired a loose hinge on the barn door. He did the chores that structured his life, but the structure felt flimsy now. The solitude he'd cultivated so carefully breached. That night, after a silent supper, he sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. The familiar scent of gun oil and worn steel a small comfort. Nia sat on the floor near the hearth, patching the tear in her dress with a needle and thread he'd given her. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her high cheekbones, illuminating the determined set of her jaw. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, full of unspoken questions and the quiet presence of another human being. He thought about the locket, about Mary. He thought about asking, demanding to know. But he looked at Nia, at the way her fingers worked the thread with such focused precision, and the words died in his throat. She was a survivor, not a thief. There was a story there, one that couldn't be forced. He would wait. For now it was enough that she was safe. Winter took hold with a vengeance in the days that followed. The snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin and barn, isolating them completely. The world shrank to the boundaries of the ranch, a monochrome landscape of white snow and dark pines under a vast, indifferent sky. For Luke, the isolation was familiar. For Nia, it was a sanctuary. She healed quickly, her resilience a quiet marvel. The wound on her shoulder closed, leaving a puckered red scar against her bronze skin. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a watchful intelligence. She moved about the cabin with a growing confidence, her initial fear giving way to a tentative sense of belonging. Their days fell into a shared rhythm, a silent partnership forged in the crucible of survival. She rose with him at dawn, feeding logs to the stove while he brewed coffee. She helped him break the ice in the water trough, for dust her mittened hands, holding the bucket steady as he worked the pump. She didn't speak much, but she communicated in other ways. A nod to indicate the woodpile was low, a questioning glance at a harness that needed mending, a small, grateful smile when he shared his portion of coffee. Her English improved with each passing day. She was a keen observer, picking up words from him like a bird, gathering twigs for a nest. Fence, axe, snow. She would repeat them softly to herself, testing their shape on her tongue. One afternoon, as he sat at the table relacing a boot, she approached, holding out her hand. In her palm lay a small, intricate bead she had woven from strands of her own hair and a piece of red thread she had unraveled from one of his old shirts. For horse, she said, her meaning clear, a charm for dust. He took it, the small token warm from her hand. Thank you. She nodded, a rare, full smile, briefly touching her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the last shadows of hardship. In that moment, he saw not just a survivor, but a woman of quiet strength and grace. The question of the locket remained a heavy presence between them, an unspoken secret he kept locked away. He planned to ride into the nearest town, Clayton, as soon as the trail was passable. It was a day's ride, a place of wary glances and grudging commerce. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed information. A lone Apache woman didn't just appear out of nowhere in the middle of a blizzard. Someone somewhere had to be looking for her. 10 days after the storm, a thaw set in. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, was strong enough to melt the top layer of snow, making travel treacherous, but possible. I'm riding to town, he told her that morning. For supplies. I'll be back by nightfall. Her face went blank, the careful neutrality returning. She looked toward the door, then back at him. "I go?" she asked, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. "No," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You stay. You're safer here." He handed her the small knife he used for skinning. "Keep this. Bar the door after I leave." She took the knife, her fingers closing around the worn wooden hilt. She gave him a single, sharp nod. The ride to Clayton was slow dust, picking his way carefully through the slush and mud. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with squat, false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a livery. As he tied dust to the hitching post outside Miller's general store, he felt the familiar weight of scrutiny. Luke Calloway kept to himself, and his rare visits were always a source of quiet speculation. The bell above the door jingled. Martha Miller, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, looked up from behind the counter. "Luke, thought the snow might have buried you for good." "Not yet, Martha," he said, handing her his list. As she gathered his supplies, flour, salt, coffee cartridges, a man stepped away from the stove at the back of the store. He was tall and impeccably dressed for a man in Clayton, wearing a clean duster and a fine felt hat. His face was narrow and intelligent, with pale, watchful eyes and a thin, manicured mustache. He moved with a languid grace that seemed out of place among the rough-hewn locals. "Pardon the intrusion." The stranger said, his voice smooth and educated, a stark contrast to the local drawl. "I couldn't help but overhear your name. Calloway, is it? You have a ranch north of here, up near the ridges." Luke turned slowly, his hand resting near the Colt on his hip. "I might." The man smiled, a polite, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Silas Kane. I'm a man of specific employment. I'm tracking a runaway, an Apache girl. The government pays a handsome bounty for their return to the reservation." He described Nia perfectly, from her approximate height to the deerskin dress. She fled during the big storm, might have sought shelter. "You haven't seen anyone matching that description, have you?" Every muscle in Luke's body went tense. This was him. This was the trouble she had been running from. "Haven't seen anyone," Luke said, his voice flat and cold. "The storm kept me indoors." Silas's pale eyes studied him, a flicker of amusement in their depths. "Of course. A wise precaution. Still, if you do happen upon her, there's a reward. $500. He produced a folded poster from his coat pocket. It was a crude drawing of an Apache woman, but the details were close enough. She can be quite resourceful, deceptive even. Before Luke could respond, the door jingled again, and Sheriff Cobb entered, a portly, world-weary man whose badge was the only shiny thing about him. Calloway. Kane. He nodded to each of them. "Everything all right in here?" "Just conducting a bit of business," Sheriff Silas said smoothly. "Mr. Calloway was just telling me how quiet it's been up his way." Cobb's gaze lingered on Luke. "Is that so?" "That's so," Luke confirmed, turning his back on Silas to pay Martha for his goods. He could feel the bounty hunter's eyes on him, cold and calculating. He loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate, betraying none of the urgency, clawing at his insides. He had to get back. He had to warn Nia. As he mounted, Silas stepped out onto the boardwalk. A man living alone in that wilderness. "It can be a lonely existence, Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice conversational. "Sometimes a man might make a poor decision out of simple kindness or loneliness, a decision that could bring him a great deal of trouble." It was a veiled threat delivered with the politeness of a parlor conversation. Luke met his gaze across the muddy street. "I've had my share of trouble. I know how to handle it." He turned dust and spurred him toward the trail home. The bounty hunter's cool smile burned into his memory. The $500 wasn't the real prize. Luke didn't know what Silas truly wanted, but he knew with chilling certainty that it had something to do with him. The ride back was a frantic race against the setting sun. He pushed dust harder than he should have, his mind churning. Silas was too polished, too patient. He wasn't a common bounty hunter. There was something else at play here, something personal. He arrived back at the cabin as twilight bled across the snow, turning it a deep shade of purple. A thin plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney. He saw her face in the window watching for him. When he pushed open the door, the warmth and smell of stew enveloped him. Nia stood by the hearth, the skinning knife still tucked into the leather belt she'd fashioned for herself. "A man was in town," he said, shedding his coat. "Looking for you, a bounty hunter." The color drained from her face. "He knows." He was asking questions. I told him I'd seen nothing. He paused and then looked her straight in the eye. "He won't stop. Men like that don't." She stood frozen for a long moment, the stew forgotten. Then she walked to her small bundle of possessions by the cot. She was going to run again. "No," Luke said, his voice firm. He crossed the room and stood before her. "No more running. Not from here." She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a terrible familiar fear. "He will find me. He will bring trouble. Let him." Luke said the words feeling truer than anything he had said in years. "This is my home. You are here. He wants a fight, he'll get one." She searched his face, looking for a crack in his resolve, a hint of doubt. She found none. Slowly, she stepped away from her bundle. That night, she didn't sleep on her pallet. After the fire burned down, she came to his cot and lay down beside him on top of the blankets, fully clothed. She didn't touch him, but she stayed close, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer two separate people sheltering from a storm. They were allies bound together against the coming darkness. And Luke knew, as he stared into the shadows on the ceiling, that he would protect her, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because the thought of his cabin returning to its empty silence was now unbearable. The thaw was a brief reprieve. Winter returned with a bitter wind that swept the snow into new, impassable drifts. The ranch became their fortress, the world beyond its borders a distant threat. But the threat was always there, a shadow at the edge of their vision. Luke took to carrying his rifle with him everywhere, even just to the barn. Nia's eyes constantly scanned the ridgeline, her stillness that of a hunted animal that never truly rests. Their forced proximity began to change things between them. The careful distance they maintained eroded, worn away by shared chores and silent companionship. He taught her how to sight the rifle, her small hands steady on the heavy wooden stock. She in turn showed him which wild roots unearthed from beneath the snow near the creek could be boiled to make a bitter but nourishing tea. One evening, as a fresh storm raged outside, he found himself telling her about Mary. He didn't plan to. He was cleaning a piece of harness, and the smell of the leather soap reminded him of a saddle he had made for her. The words came out halting at first, then steady. He spoke of her laughter, of the way she had filled the silence of the cabin with her presence. He did not speak of the fever or the suffocating grief that had followed. Nia listened without speaking, her dark eyes fixed on his face. When he fell silent, she reached out and rested her hand on his arm for just a moment. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed a depth of understanding that words could not. Later that night, she spoke of her own loss. "My family," she said, her voice low. "Soldiers came, blue coats. They burned our village, took the land for a line of iron, a railroad. I ran. Many ran. But she hesitated the name Silas. Like a stone in her mouth, he found me. Said he would help. A lie. Luke's jaw tightened. The pieces were starting to form a picture he didn't like. Silas wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a predator. The confrontation he'd been expecting came 2 weeks later. It was late afternoon, the light already fading from the sky, when Dust gave a sharp warning snort from the corral. Luke grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door. Through the window, he saw a lone rider approaching, moving at a calm, unhurried walk. It was Silas Kane. "Stay inside," Luke ordered Nia. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, her face pale, but resolute. He watched her slide the heavy wooden bar into place before he stepped out onto the porch and the cold air, a shock to his lungs. He stood on the top step, the rifle held loosely in his right hand, pointing at the ground. Silas reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin. He wasn't armed, or at least he showed no weapon. He dismounted with the same fluid grace Luke remembered, leaving the reins to trail on the ground. "Mr. Calloway." He called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "A cold day for a social call, I know. But I find myself troubled. I believe you were less than forthcoming with me back in Clayton." "I've got nothing to say to you." "Kane," Luke said, his voice flat. "State your business and ride out." Silas smiled, that thin, cold smile. He took a few steps closer, his hands held open at his sides in a gesture of peace. "My business is with the woman you're hiding in that cabin. But my quarrel is with you." Luke's grip tightened on the rifle. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Silas said softly. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small object. It was a military medal, tarnished brass on a frayed ribbon. He tossed it into the snow at Luke's feet. "Recognize it, a commendation for valor. From the 3rd Cavalry." Luke's blood ran cold. The 3rd Cavalry, his old regiment. "I was a quartermaster's clerk during the war," Silas continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Not a soldier like you, Mr. Calloway. I filed reports, I typed up commendations, and I typed up execution orders." He took another step closer, his pale eyes boring into Luke. "I typed up the order for my own brother, Private Daniel Kane, executed for desertion near the Apache River. An order carried out by his commanding officer, Captain Luke Calloway." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The past he had run from, the single act that had shattered his faith in himself, in the uniform, in everything, had just ridden up to his door. The face of the young private, barely a man, flashed in his mind. The boy had been terrified, homesick, not a traitor. But the orders had been clear. An example had to be made. "He was your brother," Luke said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My younger brother Silas," corrected, his voice dripping with venom. "A boy you shot and left in an unmarked grave. I spent years looking for you. After the war, you simply vanished. But I'm a patient man. I knew eventually I'd find a trail." The pieces crashed into place with sickening clarity. Nia, the bounty. It was all a lie. The Apache girl? Nia. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. She was the perfect bait. I found her half-starved near the reservation border. I didn't offer her help. I offered her a deal. I told her I knew the whereabouts of one of the soldiers responsible for destroying her people. I promised her a chance at revenge. All she had to do was lead me to you. And the locket, the final, cruelest piece of the puzzle. "How did you get it?" Luke demanded, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like ice in his veins. My wife's locket. Ah, the locket, Silas said with theatrical satisfaction. The masterstroke. After the war, I made it my business to learn everything about you. I traced you to a small town in the New Mexico territory. Spoke to a shopkeeper who remembered the handsome young captain who bought a silver locket for his pretty new bride. A bride who later died of a fever. He even described it to me. It took me years, but I found the tinker who made it. Paid him a small fortune to craft an exact replica right down to the engraving. He smiled. I had a copy of your wife's wedding portrait. It was a simple matter to have a miniature made. I planted it on the girl before she ran. I knew you, Captain. I knew your code. You wouldn't leave an injured woman to die. But a woman carrying your dead wife's locket, you would never let her go. You would take her in, protect her, and in doing so, you would walk right into my trap. It was an act of vengeance, so patient, so meticulously crafted, it was monstrous. Silas hadn't just hunted him. He had dissected his soul, found his deepest wounds, his guilt over the execution, his grief for Mary, and used them to forge the key to his own destruction. She's a pawn, Calloway Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She served her purpose. Now give her to me, and I'll ride out of here and let you live out your miserable days in this frozen wasteland. Refuse, and I'll burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside. The blizzard, which had been a quiet menace, began to pick up again. The wind moaned through the pines, and fresh snow began to fall soft and silent. Luke looked from the hateful, triumphant face of Silas Kane to the cabin door behind which Nia was listening to her own part in this tragedy unfold. He was trapped. Not just by the snow, but by the ghosts of his past, all converging on this single desolate patch of land. He raised the rifle until the barrel was level with Silas's chest. You're not taking her? He said the words, tasting of ash. And you're not leaving this mountain. The game was over. The reckoning had come. Silas's smile widened. It was the look of a man who had finally gotten exactly what he wanted. I was hoping you'd say that. He raised his left hand and whistled sharply, a high piercing sound that cut through the rising wind. From the trees on either side of the trail, two figures emerged, rifles in hand. He hadn't come alone. The trap had just been sprung. The world erupted in a cacophony of sound, and the sharp crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the howl of the wind. Luke threw himself from the porch as a bullet tore through the spot where he had been standing, shattering the cabin window behind him. He landed hard in a snowdrift, the impact jarring his teeth, and rolled behind a stack of firewood, bringing his own rifle to bear. The two hidden men were ghosts in the swirling snow, their positions given away only by the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkening woods. Luke fired back the recoil, a familiar solid punch against his shoulder. He worked the lever action with practiced speed, his mind a cold, clear chamber of tactical thought. This was the soldier's world. He had tried to leave behind a world of angles cover and kill or be killed arithmetic. Silas remained by his horse, making no move to take cover. He was a conductor observing his violent symphony with a detached, appreciative air. "You see, Captain," he yelled over the gunfire. "You can't escape what you are. You're a killer. You took my brother's life, and now you'll lose yours on this forgotten piece of dirt." A bullet ricocheted off the woodpile, sending splinters stinging against Luke's cheek. He fired back, aiming for the flash. A cry of pain echoed from the trees, and one of the muzzle flashes vanished. One down. He risked a glance at the cabin. The door was still barred. Good. Nia was safe for now. But the cabin was a tinderbox, and Silas was a man who kept his promises. The blizzard intensified the snow coming down in a thick, blinding curtain. It was a curse and a blessing, providing cover for both sides. The remaining gunman was harder to pinpoint, now his shots more sporadic. The wind shrieked a mad chorus to their deadly work. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin creaked open. Luke's heart seized. "Nia, get back inside," he roared. But it wasn't Nia who emerged. It was smoke. A thick, greasy black plume pouring from the shattered window. Silas had found a way to start a fire. He saw him now near the back of the cabin, tossing something likely an oil-soaked rag through the broken pane. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Luke's focus. He was caught in an impossible choice: stay and fight the gunman, or run to the cabin and save Nia from the flames. Silas had known. He had engineered this choice, this perfect, agonizing dilemma. The remaining gunman used Luke's hesitation to his advantage, laying down a volley of suppressive fire that pinned Luke behind the woodpile. Bullets chewed at the logs, forcing him to keep his head down. The smell of burning pine filled the air, acrid and terrifying. Then from inside the cabin came the sound of splintering wood. The back door, the one that led to the small lean-to, burst open. Nia stumbled out, coughing, her face smudged with soot. In her hand, she clutched the small skinning knife Luke had given her. She saw Luke saw the gunman in the trees, and her eyes, wide with terror and fury, darted between them. "Nia, run!" Luke yelled, desperation cracking his voice. "Get to the trees!" But she didn't run. She stood frozen, her gaze locking onto something on Luke's person. He was wearing his old wool coat, and from the pocket, a corner of his folded uniform tunic, was visible, the one he'd kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his trunk. On the collar, tarnished but still recognizable, was the regimental insignia of the 3rd Cavalry. Her face, already pale with fear, became a mask of horrified recognition. "Blue coat," she whispered the words lost in the storm, but her expression was unmistakable. Her eyes, which had looked at him with trust, with affection, now held the same ancestral terror. She described the look of a people who saw that uniform and saw only destruction. The man who had saved her, who had protected her, was one of them. The destroyers. The killers of her family. Silas, seeing his advantage, strode forward from the back of the cabin, a pistol now in his hand. "You see, my dear," he said, his voice a silken poison. "I told you I'd lead you to him. He's not your savior. He's your devil." The gunman in the woods ceased firing his part in the play, concluded. It was just the 3 of them now caught in a triangle of betrayal in the heart of the storm. The burning cabin behind them threw a hellish orange glow against the falling snow, the flames roaring as they consumed the roof. Luke was on his feet now, his rifle trained on Silas, but his mind was fractured. Nia's look of revulsion had hit him harder than any bullet. He was her protector and her people's destroyer, her savior and her deepest fear. "It's over, Calloway," Silas sneered, raising his pistol. At that moment, just as Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, Nia let out a guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't charge at Luke, the symbol of her past pain. She launched herself at Silas, the architect of her present one. She was a whirlwind of fury, the small knife, a silver blur in her hand. Silas, caught completely by surprise, fired his pistol, the shot going wide. He backpedaled, trying to fend her off, but she was too fast, too feral. She slashed at his gun hand, and he cried out, dropping the pistol into the snow. She drove forward, pressing her attack, the knife a desperate extension of her will. The distraction was all Luke needed. He brought the rifle up the sight, finding Silas's chest. But he couldn't take the shot. Nia was too close, a frantic weaving shape. Silas, panicked, shoved Nia hard. She stumbled backward, falling into the snow. He scrambled for his dropped pistol, his eyes wild. But as he lunged, a groaning, cracking sound ripped through the air. The main beam of the cabin roof, consumed by fire, gave way. With a deafening roar, The entire structure collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and burning timbers. A flaming rafter, heavy as a battering ram, cartwheeled through the air and struck Silas across the back. He screamed once, a high, thin sound that was abruptly cut off. He fell face first into the snow, the burning timber pinning him to the ground. The fire, fed by the collapse, surged into a blazing inferno. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the soft hiss of snow falling on hot embers. The second gunman, seeing his employer defeated, melted back into the woods, a phantom who had no more reason to fight. Luke stood rifle still, raised his breath, coming in ragged gasps. The heat from the fire was intense, a scorching wave against the freezing air. He looked at Silas's body, a dark shape being consumed by the pyre that had once been his home. Then he looked at Nia. She was on her knees in the snow, the small knife lying beside her. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was staring at him, at the insignia on his uniform. Her face was a ruin of conflicting emotions, grief, rage, betrayal, and a profound, soul-deep weariness. The battle was over, but the war for what lay between them had just begun. The fire raged for hours, a funeral pyre for the life Luke had built and the secrets he had kept. They stood in the snow, two solitary figures silhouetted against the hungry flames, the blizzard swirling around them. The heat kept the worst of the cold at bay, but it was a desolate warmth offering no comfort. When the inferno finally exhausted itself, collapsing into a glowing, smoldering ruin, a new kind of cold set in, deeper and more vast than the winter night. The barn was all that remained. It was a drafty, cavernous space smelling of hay and horse and cold earth, but it was shelter. Luke led dust into his stall, his movements stiff and automatic. He found Nia huddled in a corner, wrapped in a coarse horse blanket, shivering. She wouldn't look at him. The uniform tunic, the cause of the final devastating revelation, he had already thrown into the heart of the fire. He built a small, smoky fire in a rusty brazier he used for branding the meager flames, pushing back the gloom, but not the chill. He found a tin of coffee in an old pot and boiled water over the fire. He offered her a cup. She took it, her fingers brushing his, but her eyes remained fixed on the flames. The silence between them was a chasm filled with the ghosts of war, of family lost, of betrayals layered one on top of the other. Finally, he could bear it no longer. "It's true," he said, his voice raw. "Everything she said. I was a soldier, a captain in the 3rd Cavalry." Nia flinched but did not look up. He sat on an overturned bucket across the fire from her, the light flickering on his weary face. "My patrol. We were ordered to clear the valley for the railroad. We were told your people had raided settlements, that they were hostile." He paused, the memory tasting like poison. "We came to your village. It was a massacre, not a battle. I saw women, children. I saw things that broke me. After that day, I was no longer the same man. I followed orders, but the soldier inside me was dead." He told her everything then. He told her about Daniel Kane, the young deserter he'd been forced to execute an act of duty that felt like murder and had haunted his dreams ever since. He told her how after the war, he had walked away from it all, unable to stomach the man he had become, seeking solitude as a penance. He told her about Mary, about the brief, shining light she had brought into his life, before the fever took her, leaving him in a darkness more profound than any he had known before. "Finding you," he said, his voice cracking. "It was the first time in 3 years I felt something other than grief. You brought life back into that cabin, back into me." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I am the man who wore that uniform. I can't change that. But I swear to you, Nia, I am not the man I was." She was quiet for a long time, staring into her tin cup as if the answers were written in the dark liquid. When she finally spoke, her voice was a near whisper. "My mother," she said, her gaze distant. "She pushed me into the creek bed, told me to hide. I watched from the reeds. I watched the blue coats burn everything." She looked up at him, then her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears. "The man you were. He killed my family. The man you are. He saved my life. How can one man be both?" It was the question that lay at the heart of everything, the question for which he had no answer. "I don't know," he confessed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I only know that what Silas did to you, using your pain to get to me, that is an evil I can't forgive. He used us both." She nodded slowly, the truth of that sinking in. They were two broken people, victims of the same man's obsessive hatred, their histories colliding in a tragedy of another's design. The snow stopped before dawn. A fragile, exhausted peace settled over the land. They stayed in the barn for days, surviving on the few supplies Luke had stored there. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It was not a chasm, but a quiet space for healing, for processing the impossible truths that lay between them. Weeks turned into a month. The harshest part of winter began to relent. The sun grew stronger, and the snow began to melt, revealing the scorched earth where the cabin had stood. Together, without a word, they began to clear the debris. They salvaged what they could, a few cast-iron pots, warped but usable, a handful of tools, the scorched metal frame of the bed. They piled the charred timbers to one side. It was hard, grueling work, but in the shared labor they found a new kind of language. One afternoon, as the last of the snow was melting from the south-facing slope of the nearby hill, Luke took a spade and walked to the small fenced-off plot where a simple wooden cross marked Mary's grave. He dug a small hole beside it. From his pocket he took the silver locket, the replica Silas had made the object that had started everything. He held it in his palm for a moment, a symbol of a past that had nearly destroyed him. He thought of Mary, of the pure, uncomplicated love they had shared. And he thought of Nia and the complex, painful path that had led her to him. He placed the locket in the hole and covered it with earth, burying the last of Silas Kane's ghosts. He was finally letting go. When he returned to the clearing, Nia was there. She had cleared a small patch of earth near the foundation of the old cabin, turning the soil over with a salvaged trowel. In her hand was a small deerskin pouch. She knelt and began to press seeds into the dark, damp earth corn and squash seeds she had carried with her, saved from her former life. She was planting a garden. In the ashes of his past, she was planting a future. He walked over and stood beside her. He didn't have to ask what it meant. Her actions spoke louder than any words. She wasn't running. She wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to grow new life on this land with him. It was an act of forgiveness, of hope, of profound and quiet commitment. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt and the spring sun warm on her shoulders. A small, true smile touched her lips. He knelt beside her, his hand covering hers in the rich soil. The past was not forgotten. It couldn't be. It was a part of the ground beneath them, the history of the scars they both carried. But here, together, in the quiet mountain air, they would build something new upon the ruins.